Chapter 9. In the pregnant silence which followed this announcement, Sheriff Elmy took the outthrust scatter gun in his hands and broke it. A discharged shell tumbled to the floor, still retaining its rank odor. Muttered curses ran through the ranks of watching men. "Well, that's the gun, all right, Elmy," a plumb bob hand exclaimed harshly. "Can't be no mistake about it." Ferd lifted an accusing eye to Ezra's face. "How do you explain your possession of that gun?" he droned out. "That's simple," Ezra snorted. "A child could have figured it out, but you wouldn't bother. I was doing my own nosing around," he explained stoically, "and I found this gun chucked in a livery stall over there. Of course I hung on to it. I was aiming to learn who it belonged to." Several of the listeners attempted to shout him down almost before he had finished. Clearly they weren't prepared to believe a word he said, nor did the scoffing tend to make their attitude any more favorable. Pat knew that, discredited here as he already was, it would do no good to claim Ezra was with him at the time the shot had been fired. Grimly, he awaited the outcome. "Hell, he's lying out of a whole cloth," bellowed the man who had captured Ezra. "He was trying to hide the greener, I tell you." Ezra promptly retaliated by knocking the man down with a single sweep of his beam-like arm. It set off an uproar in the midst of which men crowded forward, their faces corded with angry determination. "Damn his crusty hide! String that beanpole up!" The cries rang out over the hubbub. "Get a rope, somebody! He didn't take no pity on Block." With affairs taking this sinister turn, Pat sprang forward coolly with Sam and Clay at his back. They formed a wall about Ezra, forcing the crowd back. And little as he liked it, Sheriff Elmy was forced to move in on this move, as he had no wish for this prisoner to be torn from his hands and strung up. "Make yourself scarce, Ezra," Pat hurled at the big fella sharply, doing his best to resist the increasing pressure of the aroused men striving to force past and seize their quarry. Ezra swung hard at a man who was making a wild grab for him, and then whirled towards the rear of the saloon. Just as he started away, he saw the bartender leap round the end of the bar to intercept him. "Oh, no, you don't," the man yelled, raising a bung starter menacingly. "We'll settle this right here." Ezra gave him a straight arm that piled the other one up against the polished bar like a battering ram, and the lanky one sprang towards the arch leading into the empty gambling hall. Amid the clamor of milling crowd, the thud of his boots quickly faded away. Pat and his companions held out for a few seconds longer to give the one-eyed man all the time they were able, and when they broke the line, drawing back hastily, the press burst past them in a trampling tide which swirled into the gambling hall. For a space their boots clattered about in there, and then the majority of them reappeared in the archway, their faces registering bitter frustration. "He hightailed it out the back door and got away," one announced disgustingly. "The boys are after him now." But as the minutes passed, a man or two stepped sheepishly out into the front door. It became plain that Ezra had made good his escape, and when Sam started that way, an angry townsman bluntly headed him off. "Stay put, you ape," the man snapped. "We ain't lost you yet, and we're not gonna." Sam measured him narrowly, then stabbed back with an express shrug. Beyond this, none of these men appeared undue incensed over their springing to the aid of an acknowledged friend, a trait this country had not only tolerated, but begrudgingly admired, and Pat turned to the sheriff. "How about a closer look at that gun, Elmy? It ought to tell you something." Ferd nodded, and picked up the shotgun which had been dropped and kicked against the wall in the scuffle. His sour eye ran over it critically. "Well, no initials or marks on her. Pretty new, it looked like. Looks a lot like the one that was laying in Starbuck's store." Starbuck himself thrust forward and examined the scattergun briefly. "Well, it come from my stock," he grunted in assent. "I'll expect to have her back after you get done with it, Ferd." His brow hoisted as he looked up. "But say, that's kind of queer." Was Stevens or Marble here in the store at any time tonight? The sheriff shot at him. No, neither one of 'em. Jake shook his head positively. Not that long-legged redhead, neither. I know because I was there all evening. It possessed a problem which Elmy did not pretend to be able to cope with at the moment, and Pat saw his indecision and grasped the opportunity it presented. Make up your mind, Elmy, he said flatly. A few minutes ago you were damned anxious to hold Clay and me for Block's killing, and now you want to grab Ezra for it. Didn't take 3 men to hold that gun. Not one of us had the chance to lay hands on it, and Ezra explained plainly enough for any reasonable man how he had come to found it. What's the answer? Elmy shot a bothered look at him from beneath knit brows. Well, I ain't prepared to say right off. That's a fact, he got out dubiously. I needn't remind you of the claim any one of us may have if you act hasty and it turns out to be a mistake. Pat pressed on firmly. I hope you do get Block's killer, but at the same time, you'll admit none of us owes him a thing. The force of this got home to the sheriff, as was plain from his puzzled expression. Moreover, he hadn't forgotten Billy the Kid. He put a few tense questions concerning Bonnie and listened with care to anyone who would volunteer an answer. The few Mexicans in the place followed this exchange attentively, for the youthful outlaw had whimsically championed their people more than once in the past, and was virtually an idol to them all. It was one of their many circumstances which made it next to impossible to apprehend him. Well, I reckon I ain't got sufficient grounds for holding you and Marble at the present, Elmy told Pat at length. Just don't be in a hurried rush to get out of town. That don't go. Pat shook his head decidedly. You either take action now, Sheriff, or we'll go and do what we please. After all, we're interested in this thing too, but don't fret. I'll see it to it that we're available when you're ready for us. He had Elmy there. Influenced by the scoffing of a man or two, however, Ferd was not given up easily. Well, that's a middlin' fair proposition, he allowed tonelessly. But I'll have a talk with that lanky partner of yours, in fact. I expect to have it if I even have to manufacture my own opportunity. Well, that's entirely up to Ezra himself, Pat tossed back discreetly. You can't blame him for running, Elmy. The boys were getting kind of rough, and I wouldn't know where he'd likely head for anyway. Oh, yeah? The lawman eyed him levelly. If you should see him, will you tell him what I said? I'll do that much, Pat grinned, but I won't guarantee his answer, and I'm not promising to use any force. Sheriff Elmy turned away with a cold indifference, immune to the faint humor in Pat's tone. Understanding he was done with the three, the men at the bar began to break up and drift about their affairs. A few returned to the alley where the shooting had occurred, while others went off to discuss the matter of Doc Woody, who was also Castlegate's coroner and undertaker, ekking out a living of sorts by combining every branch of activity connected with his profession. Pat and the others turned to the bar for a nightcap, Sam eyeing the groaning bartender sourly as he took up his drink. A fine public-spirited punk, are you? Sam rasped. Thought you'd try tripping Ezra during that scramble. Maybe you think it's fun seeing a man strung up. The bitterness in his voice was venomous. I was just going along with the law, the other snarled, paling. Don't you make no more trouble in here now, or I'll call Sheriff Elmy back. Oh, don't worry, you rat, Sam scoffed. Your bones will ache a while anyhow after that shove that Ezra gave you. I hope you sleep standing for a week. Pat put an end to this with a curt word, and their drinks finished, the three men turned towards the street, where they paused briefly. You don't reckon that Ezra was fool enough to linger in town, do you? Sam muttered. Pat shook his head shortly. Not him. There's an easy way to make sure, though. He started across leisurely for the livery, and the others followed. His horse is still here, Sloane discovered as they looked through the stalls. He spoke prematurely, however. It was his own horse that was missing. The lanky giant having evidently concluded that it was the fresher of the two. The barn was empty, explaining the ease with which Ezra had slipped in, got up his mount, and departed, the fact fitting well in with Pat's own plans as well. "We might well pile into the hay," he remarked, "and that way we can be ready to pull out early in the morning, and we'll be on our way fast." They made themselves as comfortable as possible, and Sam at least protested the brevity of his rest when Pat later aroused them long before even the faintest light was appearing in the east. They got out their horses and rode quietly down to the Venetian, just opening up. After a hasty breakfast, they pulled out on the trail before anyone else appeared to be stirring in the sleepy village. Not till the rising sun began to warm their backs did anyone feel like talking. It was Clay who spoke first, after appearing to carry something on his mind for some time. "You know," he said, "I could have been the one to shoot Block down last night. I had the chance, and you don't know where I was either." "Yeah, you could have, but you didn't." Pat nodded readily. Clay's look showed surprise. "And you know that, Stevens?" he blurted. "Yeah, he knows everything. What's your idea?" Sam thrust on abruptly, speaking to Pat. "Since you seem to have this business in the bag." Pat glanced at him in amusement. "Why, there's several possibilities, since you two seem so much in the dark. I didn't see Block get killed, and naturally I don't know for certain who did it, but there's no need to look far for any number of men anxious for a crack at the plumb bob. Don't forget that rancher Slater, who we heard accusing old Doc of starving him out, for instance. Well, he hates Block's guts. It wouldn't do to overlook those men in town altogether, either." "Wait a minute." Sam brought him up short. "What's that again?" Pat waved an impatient hand. "I'm talking about Jakes Starbuck and LeBlanche, and the two other three that Marble took half of Castle Gate away from in that poker game. To them, Bill Block was the plumb bob. I couldn't expect them to love him." "Oh, say now," Sam injected explosively. "You got a real point there. 10 to 1 them birds got together and—" Pat laughed at him. "Oh, don't be going off the deep end, Shrimp. I didn't say I thought they were responsible. I just remarked that it was one possibility among others." Clay shook his head. "I don't think that's a good guess, Stevens," he demurred shrewdly. "I get your point, but it ain't Block who carried out Dad's orders there in town anyway. That would have been Ed Gurley's department, I would judge." Pat nodded approval. "I know. How did Block and Gurley get along, by the way? Pretty big men on the plumb bob. Did they hitch okay?" Clay was staring at him in amazement. "Hang it, Stevens, you're keen as a whip," he burst out. "The fact is, they didn't get along too well at all. The day you first met me there in the store, I walked into Ed's office and found the two in the midst of a hot argument. They smoothed it over, and I never did get what it was about, but I didn't forget. Still, that can't mean anything. I don't see how it could." "Well, it probably doesn't. I was just curious." Pat turned the talk to other things, and if he caught Sam eyeing him strangely as a result, he paid no heed. Following the Apache Cache trail, they had come to within a mile or two of the place where a man suddenly jumped his horse into the trail a few yards on the fore. It was Ezra, and he was grinning broadly. "Reckon you'd probably be drifting this way," he said as they gathered about him. "Did you bring some grub for me, I hope?" The glances they exchanged might have been taken for honest dismay. The pause lasted long enough for Ezra's face to grow longer than they had ever seen it. "Dang it all, you know I ain't had nothing to eat," he groused. "Why I bothered to travel with such a pack of nitwits, I don't know." He ran on scathingly, leaving no doubt of his bitter disappointment. "Well, if you're done blowing and snorting," Pat laughed and produced a package from his saddlebag. Suppose you just set your teeth into this and give our ears some rest. Ezra accepted the fruit grumpily, but a short time later, his hunger was appeased, his temper showed marked improvement. Where are we heading? He queried, gazing about as if there was nothing more important on his mind than curiosity. Pat had turned off the cache trail at last to lead the way across the sage swells, and even Clay Marble waited for his answer with considerable interest. Oh, just keep your pants on, Pat admonished them all. We'll be soon there. Of no mind to face afresh the Mormon watchdogs in the cache without need, he was retracing the course by which he had left Axehead Canyon previously. Clay understood his objective when they topped to the pine-clad ridge and worked up through the rocky ledges to look down into the grassy canyon. That's Moon's ranch down there on the bench, Marble pointed. Anticipation imperceptibly crept into his manner. At the same time his open face showed perplexity. What's the idea, Pat? Press is no dealer with stolen stock. Nice view from up here, huh? Pat returned carelessly, and the range detective subsided. A trim figure in gingham appeared in the open door when they rounded up into the Moon Ranch half an hour later. Pat read the gladness in Esther's face as her glance fell on Clay. Her surprise declared that she didn't have that pleasure often. Her gratification was nulled only by the deep wonder why they were all here. Is your father home, ma'am? Pat asked easily, pulling his hat off. He should be back any minute, she answered, striving to interpret what this spelled. I hope you haven't brought any further trouble for us, Mr. Stevens. Oh, no, quite the opposite, I imagine, he assured her. We'll just wait out here in the yard, and maybe we'll see him coming, he pursued tactfully, as Clay dismounted and moved towards the girl, as if drawn by a magnet. The two spoke for a moment in lowered tones, seemed to have forgotten the presence of others, and presently entered the house. Ezra glanced after them narrowly. You say Marble's out here looking for steers? He muttered. From where I sit, it looks like he'll settle right now for that gal. Pat eyes at him quizzically. You don't remember back when you were that age, I suppose? He let drop. Hell, I never got no older, snorted Ezra. Only for some reason the gals don't seem to notice me no more like they used to. He spoke in perfect seriousness. Well, now that's queer, drawled Sam Salone, and ducked as his partner made a pass at him with his hat. I mean, it's queer that I never noticed it, he amended innocently, and then grinned. They were still bantering one another 10 minutes later when the screen door of the kitchen slammed and Marble emerged. Glancing around, Pat saw Press Moon advancing along the canyon trail, and Clay joined them as Pat shoved forward to greet the rancher. Howdy, Moon, Pat said. I'm back again. I want you to show young Marble here where those 7-hook steers are being held. End of chapter 9.